When beginning this research project, I initially set out to analyze the joy mutants from Lisa the Painful and what the design choices surrounding them said about addiction. I started with two research questions. How are those with addiction issues usually depicted in video games? And do these depictions challenge the depictions of joy mutants? However, this ended up expanding into an analysis of the depiction of addiction in Lisa the Painful as a whole, rather than exclusively joy mutants. This is because in my research, I realized how little there was written about addiction in video games. I saw it as a challenge to look at how addiction was represented in Lisa the Painful and analyze it myself. Without being able to compare Lisa the Painful with other depictions of addictions in video games, due to the lack of research regarding it, I ended up drawing from several sources which spoke of mental illness in video games and addiction in television and film. Addiction is a really complex thing as well, and I feel as if that reflects in the choices Lisa the Painful makes when it comes to depicting it. Depictions in this game vary from negative and harmful to sympathetic and positive. Lisa the Painful falls in a gray area between positive and negative when evaluating it as a whole. I didn't exactly come up with an answer on if it was a solely good or bad depiction. I do think I found an answer in that depictions of addictions in video games have the potential to be so much more, though. There is a good starting point with Lisa the Painful, and future depictions will hopefully build upon it. I think that disability, mental illness, etc., is still a relatively new thing for video games. There is significant room for improvement and growth. I am excited to be a part of this conversation this early into it. I truly do think we can see video games evolve and show us depictions of mental illness or disability that other mediums cannot offer. When we think of cliches in video games, the first things that come to mind are usually a damsel in distress, an amnesiac main character, or maybe a dull war setting. You would be hard pressed to find anyone whose first thought is the cliche addict, especially for a video game. In Gargiulo's dissertation, Addiction, Objection, and Abnormality, a piece delving into the stereotypes of addiction we see many forms of media fall victim to, he would point to the stereotypical diminished minds and decaying bodies we often see attributed to the cliche addict in television and film. When it comes to the conversation of cliches we see with addicts in media, one form of media that is always left out is video games. In my own research, I found that there are only around a handful of works that go into addiction in video games. Even when finding these, it is rarely the main topic of these works. It is safe to say very little has been discussed regarding addiction and addicts in video games. The closest we have come has been recent discussions regarding the new prominence of mental illness depiction in video games. Appropriate, non stigmatized mental illness depictions in video games is still a very new thing. My goal going into my research was to take this new discussion regarding mental illness in video games and apply it to the depiction of addiction in video games. How appropriate is the depiction of addiction in video games? Does it fall into cliches? Does it avoid stigmatization? To do this, I took a look at Lisa the Painful, an indie game released in 2014. Lisa the Painful follows its main character, Brad Armstrong, in a post apocalyptic land called Olath, where all women have disappeared, all except for his adopted daughter, Buddy. We follow Brad Armstrong as he goes on a journey to find Buddy after she was kidnapped, fighting his way through Olath and his own addiction as well. Brad has a history of alcoholism in his family and is currently fighting alcoholism himself, as well as an addiction to the drug joy. The in-game description of joy is, "This drug makes you feel nothing. Use it in a pinch." This is not without its consequences, though. If you continue taking it, you will eventually transform into an in-game enemy called a joy mutant, a disgusting mutation of what was once a human. Joy mutants are extremely violent and incredibly powerful. The joy mutants and joy itself are both at the center of my analysis of addiction in Lisa the Painful. To explore the complexities of the game's representations of addiction, I looked at things such as the narrative depictions of addiction, the gameplay effects of joy, the setting, and the joy mutant's appearances and behaviors. Lisa the Painful is bountiful with both negative and positive depictions, yet ultimately the negative depictions are more abundant. To analyze Lisa the Painful's narrative, I will be looking at scenes where addiction is at the forefront. I will be looking at the intro and the ending. The ending has two different versions, depending on whether you have decided to take joy throughout your run or not. I will be referring to the differences in the cutscene where Brad has not taken joy, as the joyless cutscene. In the opening to the game, we see Brad return home after being beaten by bullies at grade school. He returns to a broken home, both physically and emotionally. He walks through the door of the rundown home as we see his father throw a beer bottle at him and call him a worthless shit kid. He goes upstairs to his room to cry next door to his baby sister Lisa. We then time skip to a scene of him a few years before the events of the game, where he is taking joy. We see a scene of him finding Buddy as a baby, and he returns her to his friends. He states, "I'm not going to give her up. This is my second chance." The rest of the intro consists of scenes of Brad balancing being a father with his addiction. We see scenes of Brad passed out in front of Buddy surrounded by bottles of alcohol. We see another scene of Brad passed out upstairs as Buddy cries in the basement, not too dissimilar to Brad crying in his room. We see Brad having visions of his father surrounded by bottles of alcohol as he takes joy to make these visions disappear. We see Brad throw away his joy in alcohol, which then leads to happier scenes with Buddy. We see Brad relapse. And finally, we see Brad return home only to find that Buddy was kidnapped. The intro cutscene sets Brad up as what G.S. Cape would define as one of the four stereotypical depictions of an addict, that being the tragic hero. In Addiction, Stigma, and Movies, a piece by G.S. Cape analyzing stereotypes of addicts in film, Cape defines the tragic hero as one who struggles with addiction, who carries a theme of redemption regarding his character arc, which usually ends in death. The mission statement for Brad's character arc throughout the game is explicitly stated by him earlier. This is my second chance, which can only be presumed to be regarding his baby sister Lisa we saw earlier. This is his second chance at raising and protecting somebody. This is his redemption, which he must face while struggling with addiction. In the ending of the game, regardless if he chose to continue taking joy or not, it's too late for Brad. He is transformed into a joy mutant. The game ends after he takes out everyone in front of him, both his party members and the antagonist Rando's army, who wanted to keep Buddy safe in order to one day repopulate the world. Both his desire for redemption and the effects of his addiction taking him to the furthest depths. The final scene of the game sees Joy Mutant Brad crawling toward Buddy, where he mutters his sister's name, Lisa. In the joyless ending, we get an extra scene where the creator of Joy, Dr. Yado, states, once it's gone into effect, the user begins to lose control. They can no longer make choices for themselves. Only the user's innermost desires come out. The only plus is that it doesn't take a lot of joy in order to start the transformation. Brad falls completely into the tragic hero stereotype described by Cape. He leads a journey of redemption ultimately leading to his death, fueled by his failure to protect his baby sister from addiction, and fueled by his own failures as a parent to Buddy because of his own addiction. Keeping in mind that addiction is classified as a mental illness, to evaluate if the narrative depicts addiction in an appropriate way, I looked at what other authors had written regarding mental illness in video games. Brad's final acts fall into a mentally ill character archetype Tom Grimwood coins in Rhetoric, Commonplace, and Heroic Madness in video games, an analysis on procedural rhetoric called a monster's double. A monster's double falls under the concept of heroic madness, defined as confronting the player with a darker, uncontrollable part of the playable character. A monster's double is often still the main character, the main difference being the players no longer have a choice nor an input in what the main character does. A monster's double is often meant to explicitly show a darker side of the main character to the player, both uncontrollable and unstable, usually linked to the character's mental illness. Players have no choice but to murder Brad's party they have grown close to, as well as the army in front of him, who repeatedly plead with him to see their perspective. In Ferrari Manuela's own research regarding mental illness in video games and Gaming with Stigma, analysis of messages about mental illnesses in video games, she states that the majority of games with depictions of mental illness often depict mental illness with characteristics of insanity or violence. Brad's final actions fall under the description of insanity and are excessively violent. He continues his bloody path of destruction, not empathetic to any pleading from friends nor the opposition. Even the joyless final cutscene falls into this. Dr. Yato's speech implies it only takes a few doses of joy to start transforming into a monster. This is a direct implication. It only takes a couple of times using a drug before you begin to become violent. Going back to the intro cutscene, this association of addiction with violence can be seen with Brad's father as well. Both Grimwood and Manuela's writings support that the depiction of addiction seen in Brad Armstrong and Lisa the Painful as a whole is harmful and stereotypical, due to its strong association with madness and insanity. On the other hand, though, the first cutscenes of the game are not solely harmful. They show Brad in a more complex view, both his shortcomings as a father and the good moments he spends with Buddy while attempting to better himself. From a narrative point of view, Lisa the Painful's depiction of addiction is mostly stereotypical and negative. The foundation of Brad Armstrong's character and its entire ending sequence fall into harmful cliches, although the opening cutscene shows some appropriate non-harmful depictions. In his analysis of Fallout and Better Living Through Chems, Fallout's post-apocalyptic pharmacy, Jason Wallen mentions how biochemical modification is already very common in our society as it is in Fallout. These include things like antidepressants for those who need ways to cope with their mental illness, water pills for those who struggle with high blood pressure, even something as simple as a daily dose of ibuprofen for those dealing with chronic pain. We must consider the context of the world biochemical modification is taking place in, as biochemical modification is a requirement to live in a world that is increasingly uncertain. When looking at the drug joy, we have to look at its benefits in the context of the setting itself. Lisa the Painful takes place in Olaf, which is an anagram of loathe. Olaf is full of joy mutants and violent gangs. Even when resting in game, you have a choice to wake up to games forcing you to choose between your belongings or your party members, taking whichever one you do not choose. It's an unforgiving, violent, and certainly uncertain world full of depression and destruction. Joy, on the other hand, as stated earlier in its in game description, makes you feel nothing. As far as gameplay effects go, when taking joy in battle, you are fully healed and you get a joyed status, which increases some of your stats. If the character taking joy already has an addiction to it, all of their attacks will hit for critical damage. However, giving your characters joy can create a dependency, giving them a withdrawal status if they haven't had it in too long. This withdrawal status decreases all of their stats. When considering the setting of Olaf and the effects joy has, I think it is absolutely understandable for characters to take it. It isn't hard to comprehend that in such a gruesome world, many would fall upon joy to dull the pain or to help them survive. It is a biochemical modification similar to the one seen in Fallout, which make it easier to survive in a post-apocalyptic land. Lisa the Painful doesn't shy away from showing how many characters take joy either. Considering several characters come into your party already addicted, and the amount of joy mutants around, both of these factors support the thought that taking joy is very common. Brad is not alienated as the sole addict, as many pieces of media tend to do with protagonists who are managing an addiction. Sky Laurel Anderson's own studies regarding mental illness in video games and portraying mental illness in video games, exploratory case studies for improving interactive depictions, support Lisa the Painful's depiction as a positive one due to its medium specific, innovative depictions of addiction through its gameplay. Anderson praises games such as Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, for its interactive depiction of mental illness. Mental illness is a core part of the gameplay, with both positive and negative effects. These depictions are innovative because these are depictions that could only be represented through gaming, affecting controls, gameplay, and making it a core part of the player experience. Anderson explicitly praises depictions that go beyond what Grimwood and Manuela define as madness and violence. Lisa the Painful's gameplay depicts addiction by showing highs through buffs and withdrawals through debuffs. It puts the player in the shoes of an addict and helps them to understand why a dependency may be created to begin with. The game is significantly harder when not taking joy, and this reflects how difficult it can be when trying to break away from an addiction. Players may experience their own relapses when deciding to take joy, as the game is very difficult without it. Similar to how those struggling with addiction may see life as difficult without substances, Lisa the Painful's depiction of addiction through its gameplay is not only innovative, but humanizing as it puts players in the shoes of an addict to give them more perspective on the struggle one may go through when battling addiction. The joy mutant enemies of Lisa the Painful are what those who have taken joy even a few times will eventually turn into. Their appearances are disgusting, with broken limbs, discolored skin, elongated necks or torsos, overall alien. They are no longer human. Referring back to Anthony Garaggiolo's dissertation, Addiction, Objection, and Abnormality, their appearance falls into one of Garaggiolo's stereotypes, that being the decaying body. Garaggiolo states that the depiction of addicts usually includes them being dirty, disgusting looking, or on death's door. These appearances usually show that these addicts have put their drug of choice above themselves. These appearances distinguish these addicts as abnormal. The behavior of the joy mutant is defined by Dr. Yado in his joyless ending speech. Only the user's innermost desires come out. These desires are usually violent and fall victim to the stereotypical violence Manuela calls out, but there are exceptions. When Brad becomes a joy mutant, he only says the name Lisa, showing his innermost desires of wanting to have protected his baby sister when he was younger. The way I have interpreted this is that the most innermost desires of a joy mutant usually coincide with why they began using joy. For Brad, it was to numb the pain of not being able to protect his sister Lisa. For Blue, another character who transforms into a joy mutant and was part of the Salvation Rangers, a group cosplaying the Power Rangers, it was because of his desire to be strong enough to fight evil. This does not fall into a stereotype, and I think it is a unique and realistic way to show how addiction can take someone over. Maybe someone's addiction starts by drinking to become more social, or using cocaine for more energy to get through the workday. The appearance of joy mutants is the most harmful stereotype seen in Lisa the Painful, stripping all of the humanity of the addict away to depict them as a literal monster. However, the behaviors of joy mutants is a unique way to show why someone may have started using and how someone's addiction may have started. Lisa the Painful is a complex game. From its moral question it asks the players on if hiding Buddy from the world or repopulating it is the right thing to do, to its depictions of addiction. Lisa the Painful is littered with stereotypes in Brad's characterization and the appearance of joy mutants. However, it also shows bright spots in a genuinely innovative way to show addiction through gameplay and an interesting approach to showing how an addiction may start through the behaviors of joy mutants. I cannot say that Lisa the Painful has a good depiction of addiction in good faith, as it falls into several harmful cliches. What I can say, though, is that it does have unique and innovative ways of showing addiction. It's a mixed bag, but I do think it is a game that should be looked at going forward. As we continue to depict mental illness in video games, eventually addiction will come up. I believe that Lisa the Painful is a game that could contribute to the eventual conversation of how addiction should be depicted in video games. Its positive and negative depictions are things that I believe could truly help move the industry forward when the time comes, whether those be things to avoid or things to strive for.